Hello, good morning for real. This is gonna be all in one take, just like the previous video. I'm gonna be reading a few excerpts from The Dispossessed by Ursula Guin. This was published in 1974. I'm gonna read the synopsis on the back and inform y'all what exactly I'm reading. The principle of simultaneity will revolutionize interstellar civilization by making possible instantaneous communication. It is the life work of Chevek, a brilliant physicist from the arid anarchist world of Anarres. Chevek's work is being stifled by jealous colleagues, so he travels to Anarres' sister planet, Eros, the utopian capitalist planet, hoping to find more tolerance there. But he soon finds himself being used as a pawn in a deadly political game. The chapters which I'm going to read from are all on his life on Anarres. Um, every other chapter is Anarres, and then every other chapter is his journey and exploration of Eros. I think the chapters on Anarres give a beautiful illustration of the practicality, challenges, morality, general question around how anarchy can and should function. Chapter 4. The westering sun shining in on his face woke Shevek as the dirigible, clearing the last high pass of Neatheros, turned due south. He had slept most of the day, the third of the long journey. The night of the farewell party was half a world behind him. He yawned and rubbed his eyes and shook his head, trying to shake the deep rumble of the dirigible engine out of his ears, and then came wide awake, realizing that the journey was nearly over. They must be coming close to Abinay. This is the main city on Anarres. He pressed his face to the dusty window, and sure enough, down there between two low rusty ridges was a great walled field, the port. He gazed eagerly, trying to see if there was a spaceship on the pad. Despicable as Eros was, still it was another world. He wanted to see a ship from another world, a voyager across the dry and terrible abyss, a thing made by alien hands. But no, there was no such ship in the port. The freighters from Arras came in only 8 times a year and stayed just long enough to load and unload. They were not welcome visitors. Indeed, they were, to some Anarresti, a perpetually renewed humiliation. They brought fossil fuels and petroleum products, certain delicate machine parts and electronic components which Anarresti manufacturing was not geared to supply, and often a new strain of fruit, tree, or grain for testing. They took back to Arras a full load of mercury, copper, aluminum, uranium, tin, and gold. It was, for them, a very good bargain. The division of their cargoes 8 times a year was the most prestigious function of the Rasti Council of World Governments and the major event of the Rasti World Stock Market. In fact, the free world of Anarres was a mining colony of Arras. The fact galled. Every generation, every year, in the PDC debates in Abinay, fierce protests were made. Why do we continue these profiteering business transactions with war-making proprietarians? And cooler heads always gave the same answer. It would cost the Urasti more to dig the ores themselves, therefore they don't invade us. But if we broke the trade agreement, they would use force. It is hard, however, for people who have never paid money for anything to understand the psychology of cost, the argument of the marketplace. 7 generations of peace had not brought trust. Therefore, the work posting called defense never had to call for volunteers. Most defense work was so boring that it was called work improvic, which used the same word for work and play, but click drudgery. Defense workers manned the 12 old interplanetary ships, keeping them repaired and in orbit as guard networks, maintained radar and radio telescopic scans in lonesome places, did dual duty at the port. And yet, they always had a waiting list. However pragmatic the morality of a young Anarresti absorbed, yet life overflowed in him, demanding altruism, self-sacrifice, scope for the absolute gesture. Loneliness, watchfulness, danger, spaceships, they offered the lure of romance. It was pure romance that kept Shevek flattening his nose against the window until the vacant port had dropped away behind the dirigible, and that left him disappointed because he had not yet seen a grubby or freighter on the pad. He yawned again and stretched and looked out ahead to see what was to be seen. The dirigible was clearing the last low ridge of Netheras. Before it, stretching out southward from the mountain's arms, brilliant in the afternoon sunlight, lay a great sloping bay of green. He looked at it with wonder as his ancestors 6,000 years ago had looked at it. In the third millennium on Arras, the astronomer priests of Seridu and Dun had watched the seasons change the tawny brightness of the other world, and had given a mystical names to the plains and ranges and sun-reflecting seas. One region which grew green before all others in the Lunar New Year they called Anhos, the Garden of Mind, the Eden of Anarres. In later millennia, telescopes had proved them to be quite correct. Anhos was indeed the most favored spot on Anarres, and the first manned ship to the moon had come down there in the green place between the mountains and the sea. But the Eden of Anarres proved to be dry, cold, windy, and the rest of the planet was worse. Life there had not evolved higher than fish and flowerless plants. The air was thin, like Aras's air at a very high altitude. The sun burned, the wind froze, and the dust choked. For 200 years after the first landing, Anarres was explored, mapped, investigated, but not colonized. Why move to a howling desert when there was plenty of room in the gracious valleys of Arras? But it was mined. The self-plundering eras of the 9th and early 10th millennia had left the lodes of Arras empty, and as rocketry was perfected, it became cheaper to mine on the moon than to extract needed metals from the low-grade ores or seawater. In the Arasi year 9738, a settlement was founded at the foot of Nethera Mountains, where mercury is mined, in the old Anhos. They called the place Anarres Town. It was not a town. There were no women. Men signed on for 2 or 3 years' duty as miners or technicians, then went home to the real world. The moon and its mines were under jurisdiction of the Council of the World Governments, but around in the moon's eastern hemisphere, the nation of Thu had a little secret, a rocket based in a settlement of gold miners with their wives and children. They really lived on the moon, but nobody knew it except their government. It was the collapse of that government in the year 771 that led to the proposal in the Council of World Governments of giving the moon to International Society of Odonians, buying them off with the world before they fatally undermined the authority of law and national sovereignty on Arras. Anarres town was evacuated, and from the midst of turmoil through a couple of nasty final rockets were sent to pick up the gold miners. Not all of them chose to return. Some of them liked the howling desert. For over 20 years, the 12 ships granted to Odonian settlers by the Council of World Governments went back and forth between the worlds, until the million souls who chose the new life had all been brought across the dry abyss. Then the port was closed to immigration and left open only to freight ships of the trade agreement. By then, Anarres town held 100,000 people and had been renamed Abene, which meant, in the new language of the new society, mind. Decentralization had been an essential element in Odo's plans for the society she did not live to see founded. She had no intention of trying to de-urbanize civilization. Though she suggested that the natural limit to the size of a community lay in its dependence on its own immediate region for essential food and power, she intended that all communities be connected by communication and transportation networks so that goods and ideas could get where they were wanted, and the administration of things might work with speed and ease, but no community should be cut off from change and interchange. But the network was not to be seen run from top down. There would be no controlling center, no capital, no establishment for the self-perpetuating machinery of bureaucracy and the dominance drive of individuals seeking to become captains, bosses, chiefs of state. Her plans, however, had been based on the generous ground of Arras. On arid Anarres, the communities had to scatter widely in search of resources, and few of them could be self-supporting, no matter how they cut back their notions of what is needed to support. They cut back very hard indeed, but to a minimum beneath which they could not go. They would not regress to pre-urban, pre-technological tribalism. They knew that their anarchism was a product of a very high civilization, of a complex and diversified culture, of a stable economy, and a highly industrialized technology that could maintain high production and rapid transportation of goods. However, vast distances separating settlements, they held on to the ideal of complex organicism. They built the roads first, the houses second. The special resources and products of each region were interchanged continually with those of others in an intricate process of balance, that balance of diversity which is the characteristic of life, of natural sound, and social ecology. But as they said in the analogic mode, you can't have a nervous system without at least having a ganglion, and preferably a brain. There had to be a center. The computers that coordinated the administration of things, the division of labor, and the distribution of goods, the central federatives of most of the work syndicates were in Abene right from the start. And from the start, the settlers were aware that the unavoidable centralization was a lasting threat and to be countered by lasting vigilance. O child anarchia, infinite promise. I'm going to say that again. O child anarchia, infinite promise, infinite carelessness. I listen in the night, by the cradle deep as the night. It is well with the child. Puatan, who took the Provic name Tober, wrote that in the first 14th year of the settlement, the Odonians' first efforts to make new their language, their new world, into poetry were stiff, ungainly, moving. So that's sort of the founding of Anarres and on which their anarchy was built. So Shevek is the main character, is sort of the protagonist. He's a scientist. This is a section that sort of explores romantic partnerships. His partner has just had a baby, or is about to have a baby. Early in the year 164, the first incomplete, drastically edited version of the Principles of Simultaneity were printed in Abinay, with Saboul and Shevek as joint authors. PDC was printing only essential records and directives, but Saboul had influence at the press and in the information division of PDC, and had persuaded them of the propaganda value of the book abroad. Uras, he said, was rejoicing over the drought and threatened famine on Anarres. The last shipment of IOD journals were full of gloating prophecies of the imminent collapse of the Odonian economy. What better denial, said Saboul, than the publication of a major work of pure thought, a monument of science, he said in his revised critique, soaring above material adversity to prove the unquenchable vitality of the Odonian society and his triumph over archist proprietarianism in every area of human thought. So the work was printed, and 15 of the 300 copies went abroad to the IOD freighter, Mindful. Shevek never opened a copy of the printed book. In the export packet, however, he put a copy of the original, complete manuscript, handwritten. A note on the cover asked it to be given to Dr. Atro of the College of Noble Science at the Ayun University with the compliments of the author. It was certain that Saboul, who gave the final approval to the packet, would notice the addition. Whether he took the manuscript out or left it in, Shevek did not know. He might confiscate it out of spite, he might let it go, knowing that his emasculated abridgment would not have had the desired effect on Erasti physicists. He said nothing about the manuscript to Shevek. Shevek did not ask anything about it. Shevek said very little to anyone that spring. He took on a volunteer posting, construction work at a new water recycling plant in South Abinay, and was away at that work or teaching most of the day. He returned to his studies in subatomics, often spending evenings at the Institute's accelerator or to the laboratories with the particle specialists. With Takver and their friends, he was quiet, sober, gentle, and cold. Takver got very big in the belly and walked like a person carrying a large, heavy basket of laundry. She stayed at work at the fish labs till she had found and trained an adequate replacement for herself. Then she came home and began labor, more than a decade past her time. Shevek, about 10 days. Shevek arrived home in mid-afternoon. You might go and fetch the midwife, Takver said. Tell her the contractions are 4 or 5 minutes apart, but they're not speeding up much, so don't hurry very much. He hurried, and when the midwife was out, he gave way to panic. Both the midwife and the block medic were out, and neither had left a note on the door saying where they would be found, as they usually did. Shevek's heart began pounding in his chest, and he saw things suddenly with dreadful clarity. He saw that his absence of help was an evil omen. He had been withdrawn from Takver since the winter, since the decision about the book. She had been increasingly quiet, passive, and patient. He understood that passivity now. It was preparation for her death. It was she who had withdrawn from him, and he had not tried to follow her. He had looked only at the bitterness of his heart and never at her fear or her courage. He had left her alone because he wanted to be alone, and so she had gone far, too far, would go alone forever. He ran to the block clinic, arriving so out of breath and unsteady that on his legs that he thought he was going to have a heart attack. He explained. They sent a message off to another midwife and told him to go home. The partner would be wanting company. He left home, and with every stride the panic in him grew, the terror, the certainty of loss. But once there, he could not kneel by Takver and ask her forgiveness as he desperately wanted to do. Takver had no time for emotional scenes. She was busy. He had cleared the bed platform except for a clean sheet. He was at work bearing a child. She did not howl or scream, as she was not in pain, but when each contraction came, she managed it by muscle and breath control, and then let out a great howf of breath, like one who had makes terrific effort to lift a heavy weight. Shevek had never seen any work that used all the strength of the body. He had not looked on such work without trying to help it. He could serve as a handhold and a brace when she needed leverage. They found this arrangement very quickly by trial and error, kept to it after the midwife came in. Tekver gave birth afoot, squatting, her face against Shevek's thigh, her hand gripping his braced arms. There you are, the midwife said quietly, under the hard engine-like pounding of Tekver's breathing, and she took the slimy, recognizably human creature that appeared. A gush of blood flowed, and an amorphous mass of something not human, not alive. The terror he had forgotten came back into Shevek, redoubled. It was death he saw. Tekver had let go his arms and was huddled down a quiet limp at his feet. He bent over her, stiff with horror and grief. That's it, said the midwife. Help her move aside so I can clean this up. The two of them continued in the process of childbirth. Very gently, Shevek put one arm over her as she lay on her side with the baby asleep against her breast. In the room heavy with life, he slept. An Adonian undertook monogamy just as he might undertake a joint enterprise in production, a ballet of soapworks. Partnership was voluntary, constituted federation like any other. So long as it worked, and if it didn't work, it stopped working. This is not an institution, but a function. It had no sanction but that of private conscience. This was full in accord with Adonian social theory. The validity of the promise, even promise of indefinite term, was deep in the grain of Odo's thinking. Though it might seem her insistence on freedom to change would invalidate the idea of promise or vow, in fact, the freedom made the promise meaningful. A promise is a direction taken, a self-limitation of choice. As Odo pointed out, if no direction is taken, if one goes nowhere, no change will occur. One's freedom to choose and to change will be unused, exactly as if one were in jail. A jail of one's own building, a maze in which no one is better than any other. So Odo came to see the promise, the pledge, the idea of fidelity, as essential in the complexity of freedom. Many people felt that this idea of fidelity was misapplied to sexual life. Odo's femininity swayed her, they said, towards a refusal of real sexual freedom here, if nowhere else. Odo did not write for men. As many women and as men made this criticism, so it would appear that it was not masculinity that Odo failed to understand, but a whole type or section of humanity, people to whom experimentation is the soul of sexual pleasure. Though she may not have understood them, and probably considered them proprietary aberrations from the norm, the human species being, if not a pair-bonding species, yet a time-bonding one, still she provided better for the promiscuous than those who tried long-term partnership. No law, no limit, no penalty, no punishment, no disapproval applied to any sexual practice of any kind, except the rape of a child or a woman, for which the rapist neighbors were likely to provide general summary revenge if he did not get promptly into the greater hands of therapy center. But molestation was extremely rare in a society where complete fulfillment was the norm from puberty on, and only the social limit imposed on sexual activity was the mild one of pressure in favor of privacy, a kind of modesty imposed by communality of life. On the other hand, those who undertook to form and keep a partnership, whether homosexual or heterosexual, met with problems unknown to those content with sex wherever they found it. They must have faced not only jealousy and possessiveness and the other diseases of passion for which monogamous union provides such a fine medium of growth, but also the external pressures of social organization. A couple that undertook partnership did so knowing that they might be separated at any time by the exigencies of labor distribution. DivLab, the administration of the Division of Labor, tried to keep couples together and to reunite them as soon as possible on request, but it could not always be done, especially in urgent levies, nor did anyone expect DivLab to remake whole lists and reprogram computers trying to do it. To survive, to make a go on life, Anarres knew that he had to be ready to go where he was needed and to do the work that needed to be doing. He grew up knowing that labor distribution was a major factor of life, an immediate permanent social necessity, whereas conjugality was a personal matter, a choice that could only be made within the larger choice. When a direction is chosen freely and followed wholeheartedly, it may seem that all things further the going. So the possibility and actuality of separation often serve to strengthen the loyalty of partners, to maintain genuine spontaneous fidelity in a society which had no legal or moral sanctions against infidelity, and to maintain it during voluntary accepted separations, which could come at any time and might last years, was something of a challenge. But the human being likes to be challenged, seeks freedom in adversity. In the year 164, many people who had never sought it got a taste of that kind of freedom and liked it, liked the sense of test and danger. The drought, which began in the summer of 163, met no relief in winter, but by the summer of 164 there was hardship, and the threat of disaster if drought went on. Rationing was strict. Labor drafts were imperative. The struggle to grow enough food and to get the food distributed became convulsive, desperate. Yet people were not desperate at all. Odo wrote, "A child free from the guilt of ownership and the burden of economic competition will grow up with the will to do whatever needs doing and the capacity for joy in doing it. It is to do what needs to be doing and the capacity, it is the delight of the nursing mother, of the scholar, of the successful hunter, of the good cook, of the skillful maker, of anyone needed doing work and doing it well. This durable joy is perhaps the deepest source of human affection and sociality as a whole. There is an undercurrent of joy in that sense in Abernay that summer. There was a lightheartedness at work, however hard the work, a readiness to drop all care as soon as what could be done had been done. The old tag of solidarity had come together again. There is exhilaration in finding that the bond is stronger, after all, than all that tries the bond." Early in the summer, PDC put up posters suggesting people shorten their working day by an hour or so, since the protein issue at Commons was now insufficient for full normal expensive energy. The exuberant activity of the city streets had already been slowing down. People out off work early loitered in the squares, played bowls in the dry parks, sat in workshop doors, and struck up conversation with passerbys. The population of the city was visibly thinned, as several thousands had volunteered or been posted to emergency farm work. But mutual trust allayed depression or anxiety. "We'll see each other through," they said serenely, and great impulses of vitality ran just under the surface. When the wells of northern suburbs failed, temporary mains from other districts were laid by volunteers working in their free time, skilled and unskilled, adults and adolescents, and the job was done in 30 hours. Late in the summer, Chevek was posted to an emergency farm draft to Red Springs community in South Rising. On the promise of some rain that had fallen in the equatorial storm season, they were trying to get a crop of grain hauled and planted and reaped before the drought returned. He had been expecting an emergency posting, since his construction job was finished and he had listed himself as available to the general labor pool. All summer he had done nothing but teach his courses, read, go out, on whatever volunteer calls came up in their block and city, and come home to Takver and the baby. Takver had gone back to the laboratory, mornings only, after 5 decades. As a nursing mother, she was entitled to both protein and carbohydrate supplements at meals, and she always availed herself of both. Their friends could not share extra food with her anymore. There was no extra food. She was thin but flourishing, and the baby was small but solid. Chevette got a great deal of pleasure from the baby. Having sole charge of her in the mornings, they left her in the nursery only while he taught or did volunteer work. He felt the sense of being necessary, which was the burden and reward of parenthood. An alert, responsive baby, she gave Chevette the perfect audience for his suppressed verbal fantasies, what Takver called his crazy streak. He would sit the baby on his knees and address wild cosmological lectures to her, explaining how time was actually space turned inside out, and the chronon thus the everted viscera of quantum, and the distance one of the accidental properties of light. And then sort of just goes on a bit more about the baby. I believe I have a few more pages. This is my last little guy. Oh, and that passage was from chapter 8. This is the last little section of chapter 10. Long after Takver had fallen asleep that night, he lay awake, his hands under his head, looking into the darkness, hearing silence. He thought of his long trip out of the dust, remembering the levels and mirages of the desert, the train driver with the bald brown head and candid eyes, who had said that one must work with time and not against it. Shevek had learned something about his own will these last 4 years. In its frustration, he had learned its strength. No social or ethical imperative equaled it. Not even hunger could repress it. The less he had, the more absolute it became his need to be. He recognized that need in Odanian terms as a cellular function, the analogic term for the individual's individuality, the work he can do best, therefore his best contribution to society. A healthy society would let him exercise that optimum function freely, and the coordination of all such functions finding it adaptability and strength. This was a central idea in Odo's analogy, that the Odonian society on Anarres had fallen short of the ideal, did not, in his eyes, lessen his responsibility to it, just the contrary. With the myth of the state out of the way, the real mutuality and reciprocity of society and individual became clear. Sacrifice might be demanded of the individual, but never compromise. For though the society could give security and stability, only the individual, the person, the power of moral choice, the power of change, the essential function of life. The Odonian society was conceived as a permanent revolution, and revolution begins in the thinking mind. All this Shevek had thought out in these terms, for his conscience was a completely Odonian one. He was therefore certain by now that this radical and unqualified will to create was, in Odonian terms, his own justification. His sense of primary responsibility towards his work did not cut him off from his fellows, from his society, as he thought. It engaged him with them absolutely. He also felt that a man who had this sense of responsibility about one thing was obliged to carry it out through all things. It was a mistake to see himself as a vehicle and nothing else, to sacrifice any other obligation to it. That sacrificiality was what made Takver had spoken of recognizing in herself when she was pregnant, and when she had spoken with a degree of horror of self-disgust, because she too was Odonian, and the separation of means and ends was, to her, false. For her, as it was for him, there was no end. There was process. Process was all. You could go on in a promising direction, or you could go wrong, but you did not set out with the expectation of ever stopping anywhere. All responsibilities, all commitments thus understood took on substance and duration. So his mutual commitment with Takver, their relationship, had remained thoroughly alive during their 4 years separation. Their baby is now a toddler. They have both suffered from it, and suffered a good deal, but it had not occurred to either of them to escape the suffering by denying the commitment. For after all, he thought now, lying in the warmth of Takver's sleep, it was joy they were both after, the completeness of being. If you evade suffering, you also evade the chance of joy. Pleasure you may get, or pleasures, but you will not be fulfilled. You will not know what it is to come home. Takver sighed softly in her sleep, as if agreeing with him, and turned over, pursuing some quiet dream. Fulfillment, Shevek thought, is a function of time. The search for pleasure is circular, repetitive, atemporal. The variety seeking of the spectator, the thrill hunter, the sexually promiscuous, always ends in the same place. It has an end. It comes to the end and has to start over. It is not a journey and return, but a closed cycle, a locked room, a cell. Outside the locked room is a landscape of time, in which the spirit may, with luck and courage, construct the fragile, makeshift, improbable roads and cities of fidelity, a landscape uninhabitable by human beings. It is not until an act occurs within the landscape of the past and the future that it is a human act. Loyalty, which asserts the continuity of past and future, binding time to a whole, is the root of human strength. There is no good to be done without it. So, looking back on the last 4 years, Shevek saw them not as wasted, but as part of the edifice that he and Takver were building with their lives. The thing about working with time instead of working against it, he thought, is that it is not wasted. Even pain counts. So there you have it. There are 3 little excerpts from the Dispossessed. I think in this particular moment of time, I'm drawn to them because I was just #in love. And I just think I've been thinking a lot about what it would be to have an enduring, intimate, romantic partnership in this day and age, and how, and kind of what I can learn from, oh goodness gracious, what I can learn from the relationship between Tvek and Shivek. I'm sorry, Takver and Shivek, as well as being in a time of my life where I'm figuring out where I should be working, how I should be working. And this book, you know, it kind of it discusses how there is there are emergency sort of postings when shit hits the fan, like this idea of mandatory service expanding beyond the military function and into different spheres of labor. And it doesn't even really address social or human services very much, just necessities like mining. I think is really moving, and an area I want to see explored more in this current world. I think many regions of the United States would benefit from something like this, if not just the entirety of it. Decentralized would be challenging. I don't think we'll ever get there unless it's this sort of transition period. But to be assigned work would be really interesting. At least work that you, kind of in this last passage, is fulfilling and it is what you are good at. So those are some rambling little thoughts at the end of my little reading, as it was when I read No Particular Night or Morning, which was at the beginning of my semester, and this is the end of my semester, so I think I'll probably do these once in a blue moon. If you're watching this far, thanks for watching. That's all I have to say.